The story you were taught about the beginning of humanity is only a shadow. A reduced version, adjusted and shaped so that no one asks questions that go too deep. Yet beneath this quiet surface lies another narrative, older, more unsettling, and carefully erased across the centuries. Pause for a moment. Something was concealed in the opening chapters of Genesis, not a poetic detail, not a lost metaphor, but a piece that changes everything we understand about the world's first civilization. Have you never found it strange that certain names appear only once, and then vanish without explanation? Have you never wondered why technologies, cities, and complex skills emerge so early, so complete, as if drawn from some memory older than the flood itself? What unfolded between Eden and the Great Deluge was not merely sin and judgment. It was a clash of lineages, of knowledge, of cities raised before any known writing. It was a silent transfer of power. And when the world sank, not everything was lost. Some hands preserved what should never have survived. In the minutes ahead, you will confront this forgotten fracture in history. The woman whose name could not be erased. The wives who entered the ark carrying more than supplies. The man whose name was a countdown. And the first city of humanity, built by a murderer. Drowned beneath the waters, yet replicated by every civilization that followed. None of this should exist. And yet it remains, hidden within the silences of the text. To move forward, we must begin with the first deliberate absence, the name that should not be there, and yet endures. For beyond Eden, what survives is not innocence, it is memory. And its trail leads to a truth that alters everything we believed we knew, an ancient path that still calls to those who dare to walk through its shadows, a road long forgotten, yet one that a few still find in the Valley of Redemption. When the biblical text mentions Naamah only once and then falls into absolute silence, it is not committing a narrative oversight. It is doing the opposite. In a genealogy where women are rarely recorded, where each line is crafted to convey only what is essential, the isolated presence of a female name is not an ornament, but a deliberate sign that something was there which could not be removed without damaging part of the original story. In the concise flow of Genesis 4, where the descendants of Cain are presented with almost technical precision, and where professions, inventions, and cultural milestones emerge one after another, Naamah appears, breaking the pattern, placed not at the end as an afterthought, but at the symbolic center of a civilization that flourished long before the flood. Tradition long recognized that this solitary appearance was an unsettling disruption in the conventional narrative, and to return to it is to return to the point where the text seems to whisper something that centuries of reading tried to simplify. The genealogy of Cain is not a list of names repeated at random. It is the description of an abrupt and disruptive cultural leap. Jabal inaugurates organized nomadic life and the management of herds. Jubal inaugurates music and the creation of instruments. Tubal-Cain inaugurates metallurgy, the mastery of fire and alloys. And Naamah, with her single mention, reveals the existence of a fourth pillar, invisible yet essential, memory. The Targum of Jonathan preserves the interpretation that she was a creator of songs and laments, a guardian of oral tradition, responsible for fixing remembrance through rhythm, poetry, and ritual. This was more than aesthetics, it was technology. In ancient societies, music was the vault in which laws, genealogies, stories, and formulas of survival were stored. For the human voice was the only repository that time could not corrode. Thus, while one brother mastered metal, another mastered herds, and another mastered sound, Nama mastered what gave cohesion to the whole, the ability to transmit knowledge through generations without relying on inscriptions or buildings. This family does not represent merely the first steps of civilization. It represents the sudden appearance of a complete set of techniques that would normally take centuries to develop across distinct cultures. When an ancient genealogy records 4 fields of knowledge: organized pastoral life, formalized music, advanced metallurgy, and ritual memory, it is not describing an isolated community, but an urban center in acceleration. Cain, founder of this lineage, did not pitch a tent in the wilderness. He built a city, and cities do not arise by accident. They require planning, surplus production, division of labor, networks of exchange, defense, and, above all, organized memory. Thus, when Nama appears as the only female name, her place suggests something far greater than mere beauty. For the Hebrew Naamah, translated as pleasant, graceful, or charming, does not describe superficial attributes, but qualities associated with artistic and ritual competence, the very thing that allows a culture not only to live, but to endure. Jewish tradition recognized this strangeness from early on and attempted to fill it with explanations that, although varied, all point in the same direction. Nama was not expendable. Genesis Rabbah suggests that she may have become Noah's wife, uniting humanity's 2 lineages, the spiritual line of Seth and the technical line of Cain. If that tradition contains even an echo of historical truth, then something profoundly significant occurred behind the scenes of the narrative. Pre-flood knowledge may have entered the ark not only through instruments, tools, or seeds, but through human memory itself, through the women who carried knowledge transmitted in secret since the days of Cain. And this hypothesis, regardless of its literal accuracy, explains a striking anomaly. How could a humanity newly emerged from the waters rebuild structures, cities, tools, and techniques so quickly, as if simply resuming an ancient project interrupted by greater forces? But before reaching Noah's wives, we must look closely at the silence surrounding Nama. Scripture does not contextualize her, does not explain her role, does not justify her presence, as though the original text assumed the reader already knew who she was. Later generations did not know, and so discomfort gave birth to oral tradition. Oral tradition gave birth to commentary, and commentary preserved what the text, perhaps deliberately, left only implied. When she is associated with the invention of funeral songs and laments, it is not a matter of ritual aesthetics, but the ability to record losses, alliances, fears, and sacred stories. In ancient societies, those who control lament control history. Those who master song shape collective memory. And those who preserve memory become essential in any transition between worlds. If the flood occurred as tradition describes, then survival depended not only on wood and pitch, but on remembrance. Remembrance guarded by those whose names were not meant to be forgotten. This is precisely why Naamah's name becomes the gateway to everything that follows. It is the indication that among the descendants of Cain there were women who were guardians of knowledge, trained to preserve entire lines of wisdom that could not be left behind. It is the sign that pre-flood civilization possessed sufficient complexity to develop cultural and technical leaders, and that this complexity did not simply vanish in the waters, but found quiet ways to survive. When we understand this, we also understand that the narrative between Eden and the flood is not merely a succession of moral failures, but a fragmented record of how human knowledge, artistic, technical, and spiritual, was protected, concealed, transmitted, and ultimately reintroduced into a world that believed it was beginning from nothing. And it is for this reason that Naama remains. She is the proof that there was more in the first civilization than the direct records reveal, and that what could not be erased was preserved in the only form able to cross days of glory and days of destruction. Living memory. And it is this memory that we now begin to uncover. If the isolated mention of Naama opens a fracture in the text, it is by following that fracture that we perceive how the women of the pre-flood narrative function as invisible guardians of knowledge that could not vanish with the waters. Scripture states that 8 people entered the ark: Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and the wives of each. Yet, unlike the genealogy of Cain, which for a brief moment lets Naama's name slip, Genesis falls completely silent regarding the identities of these 4 women, as though the deliberate choice not to record them were part of the structure of the narrative itself. This silence, repeated with almost formal precision, suggests intention, not omission, because names are doors. And when doors are closed, it is to prevent access to what lies behind them. Jewish tradition and ancient texts undertook the task of gathering what the canonical text leaves unsaid. The Book of Jubilees offers names, genealogies, geographical origins, and in some cases, even skills associated with the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The Book of Jasher, mentioned in Scripture as an extra-canonical historical source, offers variations that link these women to earlier lineages, including descendants of Cain, creating a junction between 2 worlds that, at first glance, seem destined to remain forever separate. And it is precisely this junction that transforms the flood from a narrative of judgment into a narrative of transmission. Imagine the moment before the first drops began to fall. 3 young women, each brought from a different family, carrying traditions that did not exist in written records because writing had not yet become common. They carried memories of techniques, observations of the seasonal cycle, patterns of celestial navigation, planting systems adapted to specific terrains, healing recipes passed from mother to daughter, and artisanal practices that required ritual repetition. In ancient cultures, no complex knowledge was concentrated in a single individual. Memory was shared among women who transmitted their skills through daily repetition. For that reason, the absence of their names becomes so revealing. If the story wished to erase them, it would have erased them entirely. But the text preserves their existence while erasing their identity. It kept the boxes, but removed the labels. This leads us to the most delicate question: why omit the names of the 4 women who survived the end of the world while recording, even if only once, the name of Naama, who is not even part of Seth's lineage? The answer seems to lie in the logic of what needed to be preserved and what needed to be concealed. Naama appears because her presence explains a narrative gap. A whole civilization does not arise spontaneously. The wives of Noah, however, vanish because their identities would reveal which bodies of knowledge were being deliberately transported into the post-flood world. In this way, the narrative allows us to glimpse that judgment destroyed bodies, cities, and structures, but did not erase memory. For memory, when distributed among people, cannot be destroyed by external forces. It dies only when the people themselves die. And these people survived. Many rabbinic traditions, by different roots, converge on the same interpretation. Each wife of Noah carried a specific domain of knowledge. One possessed botanical and medicinal expertise, sufficient to keep a family alive without access to cities. Another brought weaving practices and the crafting of garments, essential for a world that would quickly lose its initial resources. Another preserved secrets of agriculture and food preparation, guarded in techniques requiring years of observation and repetition. And another held knowledge older and more sensitive, perhaps reaching back to a time before Noah himself was born. It is almost impossible not to imagine that in choosing wives for his sons, Noah, whether consciously or not, was constructing a repository of human abilities required to restart life after judgment. These traditions may seem exaggerated at first glance, yet they become plausible when we examine how quickly humanity after the flood returns to building complex structures, reconstructing techniques that should have been utterly destroyed by the waters. The sudden reappearance of cities, tools, construction systems, and social patterns suggests not learning from nothing, but continuity. And continuity exists only when memory finds shelter. As they entered the ark, these women were not bringing only seeds and provisions. They were bringing everything they knew, everything they had seen their mothers and grandmothers do, everything learned from observing the sky, the soil, the animals, the use of plants, and the body's response to illness and cure. Each of them represented a library that could not be written but could be remembered. And this detail makes Scripture's silence even more powerful. For when an ancient text hides names, it does not make them less important. It makes them dangerous. Dangerous not to faith, but to narrative. To reveal who they were would mean revealing where they came from, what they knew, what they carried, and why their knowledge allowed the post-flood world to flourish so quickly. This silence preserves not only the sanctity of the text, but the historical tension between destruction and continuity. The flood destroyed the surface of the world, but it did not destroy the foundation on which the world would be rebuilt. This is why the wives are not mere secondary characters. They are the link between two eras. They are the point where the present of the narrative touches the past of a lost civilization. They are the proof that nothing was truly lost, only transferred into new hands. And when we grasp this, we begin to see that what was preserved was not merely life. It was history, power, knowledge, and memory. And it is this memory, carried discreetly by 4 women whose names vanished from the page, that will shape everything we will see from here onward. The biblical statement that Methuselah lived 969 years, the greatest recorded longevity, is often treated as a curiosity or an extraordinary detail inserted merely to emphasize the grandeur of ancient times. Yet when we observe the context surrounding his birth, his lineage, and the direct link between his death and the beginning of the flood, his long life ceases to be a poetic flourish and becomes an interpretive key, explaining how pre-flood knowledge managed to cross centuries and reach Noah intact. In a world where writing had not yet been established and stories depended entirely on oral transmission, a single individual capable of living nearly a millennium became a living repository of information, a bridge between generations that would never meet, someone who carried within himself the teachings of a world that existed before civilization itself, had taken form. Methuselah is born at a moment when the lines between the human and the sacred are still perceptible. For his father, Enoch, is a figure who walks with God, who establishes dialogue with the divine, and, according to ancient traditions, receives visions and instructions far beyond ordinary understanding. If Enoch represents the bridge between heaven and earth, Methuselah represents the bridge between past and future. For while Enoch is removed abruptly from the narrative, taken by God before experiencing death, his son remains to God everything that had been revealed. The tradition preserved in the book of Enoch states that Enoch left Methuselah writings, visions, astronomical lists, calendars, descriptions of the movement of the stars and of the heavenly gates, and ordered that all of it be preserved for the generations to come, for this knowledge would be needed when the times changed and the world faced judgment. This detail is crucial because Methuselah did not merely live long. He lived long enough to witness the major phases of pre-flood humanity. He lived alongside Adam for more than 2 centuries, learned directly from those who had heard stories of Eden from the first generations, observed the spread of Cain's lineage, watched the rise of the first cities, witnessed the flourishing of the techniques and inventions that made urban life possible, and saw, too, the moral decline that progressively worsened until the Creator declared that corruption had touched all flesh. This privileged position makes Methuselah not only a biblical character, but a historical figure occupying the role of an archivist, someone who collects, organizes, and transmits information that would be impossible to gather again if he were to disappear too soon. When we examine the chronology preserved in Genesis, we notice something rarely discussed. Methuselah lives until only days before the flood begins. His name, translated as "when he dies, it shall be sent," or "his death will bring," functions as both prophecy and clock, for the world remains intact as long as he lives, and his death marks the beginning of judgment. This suggests that he was not only a guardian of knowledge, but a spiritual anchor for an entire generation. While he lived, humanity still possessed a link to the revelations received through Enoch. When he departed, that link was broken. And then came the moment when everything accumulated had to be delivered to the only family chosen to carry the world forward. Noah is born when Methuselah is already an elder, but not a frail one. He is the most learned man on earth, someone who had accumulated centuries of observation regarding agriculture, medicine, astronomy, climate cycles, animal behavior, construction techniques, and ancient rituals. The tradition of the Book of Jubilees states that Methuselah personally instructed Noah and taught him to record knowledge on tablets so that nothing would be lost. The very idea that Noah was a builder capable of constructing a colossal structure like the Ark ceases to seem like a sudden miracle and becomes entirely coherent when we remember that he had a master with 9 centuries of memory, someone who had witnessed the rise of the first city and seen with his own eyes the emergence of the techniques that made survival possible. This point changes our entire perception of the narrative. It is not simply that Methuselah lived long. It is that his long life functioned as a historical bridge, holding together everything that existed before and ensuring that nothing would be lost when the world was remade. He is, therefore, the hidden axis of civilizational continuity. And ignoring this is to lose the thread that connects Eden to the post-flood world. Many modern readers view the flood as a total reset, but the presence of Methuselah contradicts this, for as long as he lived, knowledge continued to accumulate, and by the time he died, that knowledge was already stored not in physical libraries, but in human minds that would enter the ark. Nothing learned beforehand would be entirely lost, for everything had been meticulously transferred. It is precisely here that Methuselah's figure reaches its deepest dimension. He lives long enough to witness the moral corruption spreading across the earth, but also long enough to ensure that when judgment arrives, humanity will not be left in darkness. He dies in the exact year of the flood, almost as though he had fulfilled his mission. And then we understand that the world was not saved only by the timber of the ark or by Noah's obedience, but by the faithfulness of a guardian who preserved across nearly 1,000 years the most dangerous and most precious treasure a civilization could carry: knowledge. And it is from this knowledge that the next part of the story begins to unfold. A careful reading of Cain's genealogy, with its first organized herdsmen, its pioneering musicians, its metalworkers, and its possible first guardian of memory, reveals that this group represents not merely a family, but the embryonic core of a civilization that flourished long before any known historical reference. This perception becomes even stronger when Genesis states that Cain built a city and named it after his son, Enoch. A city, not a makeshift village, not a nomadic encampment, but a fully functioning urban center, arising in a supposedly primitive world where humanity should still be learning to survive after being driven from Eden. The discrepancy between expectation and reality exposes a cultural leap that is difficult to justify through a slow, gradual development, as though something earlier had already prepared the ground for such early flourishing. The city built by Cain, though never described in detail, leaves enough traces for us to reconstruct its function and structure. For metallurgy to flourish, there had to be a system ensuring mining, permanent furnaces, steady fuel supply, and trained artisans, which presupposes a socially organized environment capable of supporting specialists who did not need to farm or herd. For music to become an inherited craft, there had to be masters, apprentices, instruments made with precision, places of teaching, and even rituals to justify its use. For organized pastoral life to exist, there had to be logistics, pastures, trade routes, resting sites, and management techniques learned over generations. To this is added the most subtle element: ritual memory, embodied in Nama, able to transform events into narratives and narratives into identity. All of this indicates that the city of Enoch was the cradle of an urban model that centuries later would be replicated in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the civilizations that arose around the Mediterranean, as though a forgotten seed had remained alive and at the proper moment found fertile soil in which to bloom again. But this city, this first human attempt to establish permanence in a world where the Creator himself had pronounced a curse upon the ground, was also an act of defiance. Cain, condemned to wander, raises walls and defines boundaries, declaring silently his refusal to roam. The city thus becomes the symbol of a paradox, a place built as shelter against the very sentence issued by the divine. And when we understand this, we perceive that this city could not survive the judgment to come, not merely because it would be destroyed by the waters, but because its very existence represented the origin of a knowledge which, if preserved without restraint, would later allow humanity to repeat the same cycle of arrogance that led Babel to condemnation. The most intriguing aspect, however, is not that the city was destroyed, but that its model reappeared almost intact only decades after the flood. Building techniques, the use of fired bricks, systems of social organization, the capacity to coordinate labor, the impulse to erect monumental structures, all of this returns as though it had simply been dormant. And this is only possible when we recognize that the knowledge-sustaining Cain city did not perish with it, but was carried within the minds of those whom God chose to survive, particularly the women whose identities were deliberately erased to preserve the secret of what they carried. This mysterious re-emergence of urban knowledge after the flood finds parallels in ancient traditions describing Cain and his descendants as bearers of advanced skills, capable of working metal, designing instruments, and organizing livestock with remarkable efficiency. These skills, in turn, are deeply connected to the rise of complex centers such as Eridu, Uruk, and other Mesopotamian cities that flourished with inexplicable speed. Archaeologists note that these early cities did not evolve slowly, but appeared almost fully formed, with temples, ziggurats, hydraulic systems, and defined social divisions, as though reconstructed from an inherited memory. This raises an inevitable question. If all later civilizations seem to have received a shared inheritance, from where did that inheritance truly originate? The answer, though unsettling, is found in the biblical text itself. The judgment destroyed corruption, but it did not destroy knowledge. And if that knowledge was born in the city of Cain, then what existed before the flood was not a scattered collection of clans, but a structured civilization whose essence was carried, even if fragmented, into the ark. This idea gains strength when we consider that Methuselah, guardian of Enoch's secrets, lived for centuries alongside the flourishing of Enoch's city and could have seen, heard, and transmitted accounts of its structure, its rituals, and its organization. He did not preserve only writings or visions. He preserved history. And that history, passed to Noah, could have influenced how the patriarch prepared his sons to rebuild the world. None of this requires fantasy. It requires only the recognition that humanity's past is deeper than a linear reading of the text suggests. The city of Cain, therefore, is not merely the first city of humanity. It is the primordial model that would shape all others. It is the beginning of a pattern repeated in megalithic constructions, in the fired brick ziggurats, in the polished stone pyramids, in the temples aligned with the stars, and in the cities that rise throughout history as echoes of a memory that never faded. Its destruction in the flood did not erase its essence. It simply dispersed its legacy. And when the world emerged again from the waters, humanity began to rebuild, not as those creating something new, but as those recalling. And in this quiet work of remembrance, we begin to perceive that human history does not begin after the flood. It begins again. And this new beginning only becomes meaningful when we understand what existed before the waters covered the earth. The death of Methuselah, after centuries holding together the thread of an entire civilization, is presented in Scripture with the same simplicity that described his long life, as though the greatest recorded longevity were merely a chronological detail and not the central piece of a mechanism that kept the world stable for nearly a millennium. Yet when we observe closely the exact coincidence between his departure and the beginning of the flood, we perceive that his existence went far beyond the limits of extraordinary biology. It functioned as a mechanism of restraint, a spiritual barrier preserved by someone who carried within himself the legacy of Enoch, the accounts of Eden, the memory of the first cities, and the body of scientific, ritual, and astronomical knowledge accumulated since the dawn of humanity. The name Methuselah, whose etymology points to the idea that when he dies it shall be sent, or his death will bring, is not a poetic accident, but a prophetic sentence defining his role in the world. While he lives, judgment is suspended. When he departs, what had been held back is released. This means that his presence on earth acted as a boundary, a seal that prevented human corruption from advancing without opposition. And when his life ends, almost as though a protection had been removed, the world becomes vulnerable to the waters that had been decreed since ancient times. This detail, often overlooked by modern readers, reveals that the flood was not merely the consequence of human wickedness, but also the result of the withdrawal of the last guardian of a memory that could not remain among those who had completely turned away from the Creator. Noah, who grows up in Methuselah's shadow, inherits not only his lineage, but his responsibility. He is trained by someone who lived with Adam, learned from Enosh, witnessed the birth of Cain's city, observed the rise and moral decline of humanity, and carried with him records and visions describing the heavens, the cycles of the moon, the organization of the seasons, and the calculation of calendars that would only be rediscovered thousands of years later. The Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch preserve the tradition that Noah became a scribe because Methuselah taught him to record, to organize, and to preserve what he had received. Thus, when Noah appears in the narrative as a righteous man who walks with God, he is not merely obeying a calling. He is continuing a mission that began with Enoch and took shape in the hands of his grandfather. This continuity becomes even clearer when we examine the technical ability involved in the construction of the ark. Scripture gives measurements, proportions, and detailed instructions, but it does not describe the origin of the knowledge required for Noah to transform them into reality. Building a vessel of monumental scale was not a task that could be learned from nothing, especially in an era without port cities, shipyards, specialized tools, or even smaller vessels as reference. The ark is not merely miracle, it is memory. It incorporates ancestral techniques, combines engineering principles known only to those who had seen ancient structures, and uses the sort of organization that appears only in societies which have already learned to work at scale. It is impossible to understand the ark without understanding that Noah inherited knowledge that was not in the hands of most people who lived on earth at that time. The death of Methuselah therefore marks not only the beginning of the flood, it marks the moment when all this legacy must find refuge. And that refuge is not a wooden box, but the minds and memories of those who enter the ark. Noah does not carry only animals and provisions, he carries history. His wife and daughters-in-law do not carry only seeds and utensils. They carry techniques, songs, rituals, remedies, survival practices, family traditions reaching back to the days before the first murder. And it is this gathering of human memories, distributed among 8 survivors, that allows the post-flood world to flourish far more quickly than would be possible in any hypothetical fresh beginning. This realization transforms our understanding of the flood. It does not erase everything. It edits. It removes structures, destroys cities, halts violence, yet allows the essence of the first civilization to escape, whether intentionally or not. And it is this essence that gives rise, only a few decades later, to the first post-flood cities such as Babel, which emerge with a speed incompatible with a world supposedly starting from nothing. Humanity rebuilds, because it already knows how to rebuild. It remembers because it was taught to remember. And it advances because it received, through Methuselah and his inner circle, knowledge that not even the waters could destroy. From this point, we begin to see that the death of the guardian does not end the story. It merely releases what had been prepared in silence. And when the waters finally begin to rise, it is not merely the end of an era. It is the beginning of a process revealing that memory, when hidden behind silence, can withstand even total destruction. The waters finally recede, and the ark comes to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. And Scripture describes the return of life with the serenity of someone narrating a pure new beginning, as though the world were being inaugurated once more after absolute purification. Yet as we observe what humanity does in the first years after the flood, it becomes clear that this is not an innocent beginning, but an accelerated return to practices, knowledge, and structures that had existed long before the destruction. The world emerges from the waters with memory, and this memory manifests so swiftly and so precisely that it becomes impossible to ignore that something profound had survived the storm. Not in tablets, artifacts, or ruins, but in the lives of those who escaped. Thus, the post-flood era ceases to be a blank page and becomes the quiet continuation of a story that never wished to die. The first evidence of this phenomenon appears when we observe how quickly the new generations establish cities. Little more than 7 decades separate the end of the waters from the beginning of Babel's construction, and this interval, so brief in civilizational terms, reveals a disturbing detail. Building a city requires far more than desire or labor. It requires accumulated techniques, consolidated social organization, and the ability to replicate urban models that do not emerge spontaneously. What appears in the post-flood world, with its fired bricks, mortar systems, division of labor, planning, and coordination, could not have been developed so rapidly from nothing. This means that the original model, the one created by Cain and his descendants, continued to exist, even if only as memory. The survivors were not inventing. They were remembering. This phenomenon of civilizational memory becomes even more evident when we examine the rise of Nimrod, the figure who leads the first great urban enterprise after the flood. Noah was still alive when Nimrod became a leader and founder of the first post-flood cities, and this temporal overlap shows how the knowledge passed down from earlier generations found the perfect place to re-emerge in ambitious hands. Scripture declares that Nimrod became the first mighty one on earth, an expression that suggests not merely physical strength or political leadership, but mastery over something that set him profoundly apart from his contemporaries. If he inherited traditions, techniques, or ancient objects discreetly transmitted through families, then his rise ceases to be an isolated phenomenon and becomes the direct consequence of a legacy that crossed the waters. And when Jewish traditions mention that Nimrod possessed ancestral garments granting him authority, or ancient writings containing forbidden knowledge, we realize these narratives are not attempts to explain the impossible. They are attempts to preserve fragments of a memory that refused to vanish. The city of Cain, though buried, had not been forgotten. Its structural principles, its urban logic, its internal organization, and even its ambition seeped into the new world. Post-flood cultures begin to erect temples, ziggurats, and monuments aligned with the heavens with a precision requiring years of astronomical observation, as though the constellations had already been mapped long before the world was destroyed. The alignment of ancient structures with stellar patterns, found in archaeological sites worldwide, suggests that this knowledge did not arise independently in various cultures, but derived from a common matrix, a matrix that existed before the flood and somehow survived the devastation. At this point, the biblical narrative of Babel becomes even more revealing. If the flood were truly a complete reset, Babel should not have happened so soon. The construction of a tower capable of uniting an entire population under a single purpose, using advanced engineering techniques, requires a degree of organization impossible for a humanity supposedly reborn from nothing. Yet there they were, mastering fired bricks, employing bitumen as mortar, and above all expressing the same ambition that had shaped the city of Cain. The attempt to create permanence in an unstable world, Babel, is the proof that knowledge survived. And the divine statement, "Now nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them," is not a warning about the size of the tower, but about the magnitude of a knowledge that still pulsed beneath the surface of the new world, ready to transform humanity once again into an advanced and potentially corrupted civilization. This is the point at which we perceive that the flood, despite destroying physical structures, could not destroy what takes root in human memory. The accelerated reconstruction of the world reveals that there were too many skills, too many techniques, too many memories for humanity to have begun from zero. The women who entered the ark preserved domestic, medicinal, agricultural, and ritual traditions. Noah preserved celestial maps, calendars, astronomical practices, and technical knowledge. His sons preserved the organizational logic inherited from an ancient civilization, and thus every reconstruction in the post-flood era is not an invention, but a recovery. When Babel finally rises, it does so not as innovation, but as echo. Echo of a lost city, echo of a memory that survived the waters, echo of a civilization that, even destroyed, continued to breathe through its survivors. And when God intervenes to scatter the peoples and confound their languages, He is not merely punishing human arrogance. He is breaking the last bridge that could reconnect the world to its former state. It is the final attempt to dismantle a pattern that began with Cain and which, if left unchecked, would again lead humanity to the same fate, an ambition the Creator could not allow to flourish once more. Thus, the post-flood world stops being a chapter of reconstruction and becomes a chapter of remembrance. Remembrance that had to be fragmented, scattered, and diluted so that it would not become once again a force capable of challenging the heavens themselves. Yet even fragmented, this memory would continue to haunt the ruins of future civilizations, resurfacing in impossible monuments, in myths of beings who taught the arts of the world, and in traditions speaking of a time when human beings mastered knowledge that seemed to have come from elsewhere. And it is at this point that the story begins to reveal its deepest pattern. The Tower of Babel rises upon the plain of Shinar as the visible manifestation of an ambition that did not begin in that moment, but had been forming since the day Cain decided to build the first city and impose permanence upon a world that had condemned him to wander. Babel becomes the late reflection of that lost city, the proof that the knowledge which crossed the flood, though fragmented, still held enough power to reorganize populations, raise complex architectures, and renew within humanity the illusion that it was possible to recover all that had been destroyed. The tower, therefore, ceases to be merely a project and becomes memory attempting to reassemble itself. And it is within this quiet convergence between remembrance and reconstruction that the plan behind the flood reveals its deepest fault. The waters could dismantle walls and cities, but they never reached what remained guarded within the survivors. The traditions preserved by the ancients recognize this point clearly, for they describe Babel as the involuntary reunion of fragments of knowledge that should have remained separated. Languages united, techniques aligned, ambitions converged, and the result was the accelerated recreation of the spirit of the first city. There again were the impulse toward permanence, the social organization characteristic of advanced centers, the coordination of crafts, and the human capacity to manipulate natural elements to raise a monumental work. Nothing there sounded like a beginning. Everything sounded like a return. And when God declares that nothing would be impossible for that generation, He is not referring to the height of the tower, but to the magnitude of a knowledge which, if allowed to remain whole, would rebuild every aspect of the civilization that existed before the flood, including its faults. At this moment, we perceive that the divine intervention was not an act of punishment, but of containment. The confusion of languages does not destroy humanity. It only prevents the surviving knowledge from recombining in its full form. What had once been a living library shared among 8 people now becomes a scattering of fragments across different peoples, regions, and traditions. Noah and his descendants carried a complete inheritance, but Babel breaks it into multiple paths. Each people receives only part of the ancient memory. One inherits astronomy, another construction techniques, another origin myths, another agricultural rituals. And thus, the great narrative of the first civilization becomes fragmented beneath the appearance of multiple independent cultures. This fragmentation explains why megalithic monuments appear in places as distant as the Levant, Anatolia, the Nile Valley, Mesoamerica, and the remote islands of the Pacific. Each culture carries a piece of the original technique, but never the whole. The knowledge that allowed the raising of structures weighing hundreds of tons, the carving of stone with astronomical precision, and the organization of societies around celestial observations does not arise spontaneously. It is the remnant of something that existed before, preserved imperfectly, like echoes of a book from which most of the pages have been torn, but whose margins still contain hints of what the text once said. This is why so many mythologies speak of beings who taught agriculture, writing, astronomy, and architecture. They are attempting to explain how such refined skills could have appeared so early among so many different cultures. At the same time, these traditions maintain silence around whatever could reveal the original unity. In all of them, the source of knowledge is attributed to mysterious figures, civilizing gods, messengers, bringers of fire, fallen heroes or sages who walked among humans for brief moments. And yet, when we return to the biblical narrative, we see that the answer is simpler than it appears. The guardians of this knowledge were not gods. They were people. People whose names were erased. People who carried traditions before the flood. People who passed down memories during the building of the ark. People who, once they returned to dry land, taught their children and grandchildren everything they knew. The world marveled at temples, but forgot the hands that taught others how to raise them. Seen through the lens of continuity, something further is revealed. Naamah, the woman whose name survived every attempt at erasure, becomes the symbol of the first guardian. The wives of Noah symbolize the continuity of memory. Methuselah symbolizes the bridge between eras. The city of Cain symbolizes the birth of technique. The ark symbolizes the transfer, and Babel symbolizes the fragmentation. Each of these pieces forms a mosaic that reveals a truth that should never have survived, yet somehow passed through time in ruins, in myths, in scattered traditions, and in questions that refuse to disappear. By the end of this investigation, we see that human history is not a straight line, but a cycle of memory and forgetting. The flood did not erase the first civilization. It merely concealed it. Babel did not destroy knowledge. It merely divided it. And the ruins we uncover today, impossible structures, advanced settlements, precise calendars, and mythologies that echo the same essential narrative, are silent witnesses of a truth that remained buried, but never dead. The civilization that arose beyond Eden did not vanish. It fragmented into us. Every people that raised monuments, recorded myths, charted the heavens, or preserved agricultural traditions was, without knowing it, attempting to recover a piece of what had been lost. And thus history became a vast palimpsest, where each generation writes over earlier traces without ever fully erasing them. When we look back from this perspective, we understand that the initial question, what survived the flood, was never about objects, cities, or artifacts. It was about people, about memories that resist destruction, about names that appear in scripture like cracks through which light escapes, about fragments revealing, little by little, the first civilization of humanity. And if we have come this far, it is because that memory is still alive. It breathes in the stories we tell. It reappears in the ruins we unearth. It echoes in the questions that refuse to die. And so long as there is someone willing to look beyond Eden, this truth will continue to find a way to be remembered.